Thank you again, and I will talk to you soon. I urge all your listeners to keep tuning in to Sailing Beyond Knowledge Radio.
Hello, this is Sailing Beyond Knowledge Radio, episode 59. I'm your host, Carlita. Today you will learn about the work and views of Dr. Patrick Moore, who is one of the original founders of Greenpeace. We discuss his views on Greenpeace and issues related to the climate driving forces, clearing up the climate scientism that's out there and political agendas of climate, energy and more. Now, listeners might expect me to interview people who have views and work aligned to my own. Personally, I believe as an investigative journalist to look at all perspectives on different topics, especially today in a political climate that is leaning more towards censorship of free speech rather than encouraging different views. What this means is viewers and listeners always must question and keep an open mind and seek their own empirical evidence and observations. There are a few things Dr. Moore and myself agree upon. One of those is seek evidence and observe. And in the world of science, scientists will have different data and evidence and perspectives on issues to keep science real. This is what needs to be preserved. Objective science, especially, is an important way to move forward and expand science. If it's suppressed, then we can't really explore and move forward and evolve. That's just the way it is. And I notice that today there's a lot of scientism out there, and my job in many ways as a writer and interviewer is to keep the debate alive and encourage people to dig deeper always and not just take mainstream media as the be-all and end-all of your information. The objectivity in science and journalism and health are all very, very skewed at the moment. And it's so important that people become aware of the political and financial agendas that drive these skewed perspectives. And I think Dr. Patrick is a great example of someone who's willing to speak up about controversial topics. A lot of work he does is really important, although I don't agree with everything that he does, but I have a great deal of respect for him. And he's a very courageous man, especially with his early work, and he continues to be by speaking out and educating people on climate. So I really am so happy that he gave his time today on this show and talks about these controversial topics that other environmental scientists won't speak about. And many environmental scientists and campaigners may be opposed to, and it's important again for us to look at every angle, especially with energy and environmental issues, and pull these together to have a better picture, a more objective picture, and a healthy debate to keep moving forward in science and resource management and environmental management and preservation, as it is the only way we can build and progress and evolve. So if I'm interviewing someone with different perspectives, it's important to engage audience in healthy debate, even if I don't agree with all the views the people that I'm interviewing, and if they don't agree with mine. It helps keep a healthy perspective on things, and we can all learn from one another rather than oppressing perspectives. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing the job of a real journalist or interviewer, which is to give everyone a voice and leave it to the listeners to make up their own minds. And I think this interview illustrates this more than others that have been done in the past. So just to give a background to Dr. Moore's professional work, Dr. Patrick Moore calls himself the sensible environmentalist, and he has been a leader in the international environmental field for more than 45 years. He is co-founder of Greenpeace and served for 9 years as President of Greenpeace Canada and 7 years as Director of Greenpeace International. As the leader of many campaigns, Dr. Moore was driving force, shaping policy and direction for 15 years, while Greenpeace became the world's largest environmental activist organisation. And in recent years, Dr. Moore has been focused on the promotion of sustainability and consensus building among competing concerns. He was a member of the British Columbia government-appointed Roundtable on Environment and Economy from 1990 to 1994. And in 1990, Dr. Moore founded and chaired the BC Carbon Project, a group that worked to develop a common understanding of climate change. Dr. Moore has served for 4 years as Vice President Environment for Water Furnace International, a manufacturer of geothermal heat pumps for residential heating and cooling for renewable earth energy. He also served as Vice President Industry and Government Affairs for Next Energy Geothermal, the largest distributor of geothermal systems in Canada. As chair of the Sustainable Forest Committee of the Forest Alliance of BC from 1991 to 2002, he led the process of developing the principles of sustainable forestry, which was adopted by a majority of the industry. In 2000, Dr. Moore published Trees Are the Answer, a photo book that provided a new insight into how forests work and how they can play a powerful role in solving many of our current environmental problems. In 2013, he published Confessions of a Greenpeace Dropout, The Making of a Sensible Environmentalist, which documents his 15 years with Greenpeace and outlines his vision for a sustainable future. From 2000 to 2012, he served as Chair and Chief Scientist of Green Spirit Strategies, a consultancy focusing on environmental policy and communications in forestry, agriculture, fisheries, aquaculture, mining, biodiversity, energy and climate change. From 2006 to 2012, he served as co-chair in Clean Energy's Safe Energy Coalition, a US-based advocacy mission to build public support for more nuclear energy plants to provide electricity. In 2013, Dr. Moore, with his brother Michael and other family members, founded the Allow Golden Rice Society, a non-profit organization dedicated to seeing golden rice approved for commercial agriculture to feed 250 million children, mainly in tropical areas, who are deficient of vitamin A. And in 2014, Dr. Moore was appointed Chair of Ecology, Energy and Prosperity at the Frontier Centre for Public Policy. In 2015, he joined the founding member of the CO2 Coalition in Washington, D.C., chaired by William Happer, and was appointed a founding director of the organization with the aim of educating on the benefits of carbon dioxide for life on Earth. In 2019, Dr. Moore was elected chairman of the board of the CO2 Coalition and now serves as director. In 2021, Dr. Moore published his latest book, Fake, Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom, exposing fake news and fake science, climate disasters, coral reefs, polar bears, plastic, nuclear energy, and more. You can find more out about his work at EcoSense Environment Inc. and find his book and other information there. So it's www.ecosense.me. And I really hope that you enjoy this interview and see the value here in what I was saying about how we need to give more of a voice to so many different controversial topics that we touch on here. So see you on the other side of the interview, and I hope you find it useful, and please do share and go to Dr. Moore's website. Thank you. World. I'd just like to introduce Dr. Patrick Moore. Hello, Patrick. How are you doing?
Hello, Carlita. I'm very well today. I had a bit of dentistry yesterday that's still healing, but other than that, I'm just fine.
Okay, that's fantastic. I'm glad you can still talk after seeing the dentist. Okay, so let's just start by you telling us a little bit about your background, because not many people know that you're one of the main founders of the original Greenpeace.
Yes, I was. It was 1971. I grew up in the wilderness of northern Vancouver Island. So as a child, innately learned about nature on the tide flats, in the forests, on the ocean. I was right by the Pacific. So it was a completely unique childhood. I grew up on a floating village of about 60 homes and other buildings, my father's logging camp, in a windswept northern inlet on Vancouver Island in the rainforest, which was complete wilderness at that time, and most of it still is. So I was sent to boarding school because my one-room schoolhouse that I went to by boat every day only went to grade 8. And so I was sent to Vancouver, where I learned city ways. I'd been going to Vancouver in the Christmas season all through the years. Everybody went out because it was only once a year you got out of the place. And so I knew about the city a little bit, and I excelled in life science in high school, in biology and genetics and biodiversity and biochemistry and all the other bios, and entered a degree, a Bachelor of Science degree at the University of British Columbia in forestry and biology. So I studied the scientific aspect of forestry rather than the technical side of how to get a tree out of the woods, which I already knew because I grew up in a logging family. But I wanted to understand the science, the genetics of trees and of the forests and all of the other aspects about the ecology, which is a word I didn't hear, and no one else did either in those days, until I went to a noontime lecture by Vladimir Krajina, a Czech ecologist who'd been Minister of Forests and fled the communists and came to Canada and ended up being a professor at UBC, along with many other professors who came from Hungary during the invasion in '56. So the University of British Columbia benefited from this infusion of top forestry people from the middle of Europe, where silviculture was invented. And well, just to make just one point here that I think is really important for people to understand, because everybody thinks the forests are being decimated in the world. They say the Amazon is being raped and the Congo. It's all lies, but they can say that because no one goes there to see for themselves. How many people go to the Amazon? There's hardly anybody there in the first place because it's not a very easy place to live. It's too hot and humid for most people. So in the 1700s, the forests of Europe were reduced to less than 10% of the entire area of Europe due to the fact that wood was the primary fuel for everything. There were no fossil fuels yet. And so wood was used for steam engines and steel mills and all the heating in all the buildings. And this resulted, for the first time in history, the reduction of the forest where it was shrinking because of overcutting for the use of fuel. And that's why forestry, otherwise known as silviculture, was invented in Central Europe, because of the need to be able to learn to grow trees in the same way that people learned to grow plants and animals 10,000 years earlier when agriculture was invented, because the wild animals and plants were not enough to sustain a city as became established then. Well, forestry came way later. And today, to make a long story short, 43% of Europe is forested, compared to less than 10% 250 years ago. Not a very long time. And so that's what we are capable of doing with our intelligence about agriculture and forestry. We're not destroying the planet. We are actually gardening it. And gardening is not a bad thing, as long as you keep a balance between nature, actual biodiversity, which these days more and more land is being set aside as reserves for wildlife. That's been going on for a long time. It started in the United States and Canada with the national parks. Europe and Asia never had any national parks. That idea didn't exist. They figured the whole landscape should be available for their use. And today you see more and more preservation occurring on pieces of land that are being set aside, being purchased by conservation organizations. So we are not destroying the world, but the green so-called movement, and there's no worse word in a way than the way the word green is used. It means nothing. It's like saying that food is especially organic. Like you go to the store and it says this food is organic. All food is organic. If you look at the scientific definition of organic, which means the chemistry of carbon. That's what organic chemistry is. And all other chemistry is called inorganic chemistry, about steel and copper and chlorine, or every other element is inorganic chemistry, because carbon is the chemistry of life. So it's a completely separate thing in that carbon is the basis of all life. And so we have given it a separate category than all the other elements, even though many of them are also included in living things, like sodium chloride, for example. Table salt is an essential nutrient, and we have no choice but to ingest it or we won't live. So my understanding of the ecology is that what the green movement is doing is it's splitting the urban people from the rural people. The rural people are the ones who are blamed for all the destruction of the environment, all of the cutting and the drilling and the blasting and the fishing and the foresting and everything else that's going on out there. They see that as the enemies of the earth. They don't realize that the only reason those people are doing that is so they can have all the stuff to build cities with and the food that they need. If you're living on the 30th floor of a condo in the center of an urban area, you haven't got enough room on your balcony to grow your food, especially if it's facing north. So
can I just
yes,
interrupt slightly?
Always interrupt me whenever
Sorry.
you want, Carlita,
No,
because I'm
I want-
uninterruptible otherwise.
Okay, no, I want you to carry on talking about that in a bit, but just for listeners to tell them a little bit about your background, because a lot of people don't know that you are one of the original founders of Greenpeace, and this is a very well-known organization today. So I just would love for you to begin by telling your story. I met Rex Weiler about 17 years ago in London when he gave a talk.
Yes.
And I'm just so grateful to meet you as well. So I think a lot of people would love to hear how you formed the original Greenpeace and some of your memorable moments, and then we can go back on to the other topics.
Okay, well, I got to where I was doing science at the university. I then entered a Ph.D. in ecology, and actually at that time in the late 60s, that word had not yet been in the public press, in the popular press. That word, environment, was being talked about a lot by then, but ecology was an obscure science that no one had ever heard about. And eventually it became a very important part of what everybody's hearing about. I excelled in science in my PhD, and while I was doing it, it was the height of the Cold War, the Vietnam War, the threat of all-out nuclear war, and the emerging consciousness of the environment, all happening at once. And so I decided to join this small group that had started to meet in the Unitarian Church basement in Vancouver, BC, Canada, which is where Greenpeace was born. And we planned a voyage to the Aleutian Islands, to the island of Amchitka, where the United States was detonating 5 megaton hydrogen bombs as part of a program of testing these weapons. And we said, we're going to sail and stop that test. And we sailed across the Pacific Ocean in the fall of the year when the storms were horrific. And we got arrested by the Coast Guard. That got us on Walter Cronkite's Evening News, which was the biggest news at the time in the United States. And pretty soon, tens of thousands of people were marching in the streets to stop the bomb. So it proved that just by getting up out of your chair, not just walking down the street with a picket sign, but actually going to the scene of the crime and risking your lives and being a team, we showed that we could beat the biggest organization in the world, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, perhaps the most powerful. At least they certainly had the most destructive potential of any organization on the planet at that time. And it wasn't 2 months till President Nixon announced the cancellation of any further nuclear tests up there. So, whoa, we won. What do we do next? Next, we went after French atmospheric nuclear tests. Can I show a slide or two?
Absolutely, go ahead.
Let me see this. This is me in 1971 on the way to those campaigns in Alaska. I'm not going to go into the slideshow because it seemed kind of hard to get out of when we tried it there. So I'll just show you. This is us, me under the P in 1971. That's the sail of the boat we went across the ocean with. It was a motorized vessel, but they have these sails to keep it from tipping so much. The wind helps. Here's the French atmospheric nuclear testing in the South Pacific. The people of France didn't even know France was still doing this in 1972. We sailed a boat twice into these tests and forced them to go underground. They were the only ones that were still regularly testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere and sending radiation all around the world. And we beat them too. So what did we do next? We sailed against the Russian and Japanese whaling fleets in the North Pacific because we'd learned how to go out in boats. And a whale scientist came to us and said, you guys are the only one who know how to go in boats. Will you come and save the whales? 30,000 great whales were still being slaughtered on the high seas, out of sight of anybody on the land at that time. So what we did was we confronted the whalers. Here's the killer boat with whales tied up to the side of it here, and then they go up here and get cut up. And so that's me running this little rubber boat, got in front of the harpoons to protect the fleeing whales and made it on television around the world, coming into San Francisco with this film footage. And this is what really put Greenpeace on the map.
What year was that?
That was 1975, this first campaign. I was on the high seas every summer for 5 years with our crew. We ended up with a 150-foot ex-minesweeper that was, took 32 people on it out into the ocean to confront the Russian and Japanese whalers every summer for 5 years. And we won in the end. The International Whaling Commission, which we were also attending all the time at the political level, voted against further whaling in the Pacific in 1981. Took that long, but we did succeed in stopping this. And since then, the whale populations have grown tremendously. And here I am, Canada was still slaughtering 250,000 baby seals nursing at their mothers on the ice floes off east coast of Canada. I'm sitting on one saying, please just let me save this one. And of course they didn't. I'm being arrested for sitting on a baby seal. This was contrary to the seal protection regulations, which should have been called the seal hunt protection regulations, rather draconian name for that piece of legislation. And then I left Greenpeace. Now, this is after 15 years of campaigning. I could go on for 5 hours about what we did. And if people want to read the history, my second book was Confessions of a Greenpeace Dropout, The Making of a Sensible Environmentalist, which is on Amazon still. It's sold very well over the years. And it gives the full history of Greenpeace, the 15 years I was in it, how it started, what our philosophy was, all the things we did. There's so much more than I've shown you here. But I had to leave Greenpeace after 15 years because of two things. At the high philosophical level, we were called Greenpeace. Green was for the environment, peace was for preventing destruction of humanity by nuclear war and pollution and all the other things. So we cared about people too. The peace was about people. The peace got dropped from the philosophy, and the environmental movement started characterizing humans as the enemies of nature, as if we were the only evil species on the planet, when in fact we have evolved with all the other species. We are part of nature. There's no doubt about that, that we are part of the evolutionary process of life. And we also are mostly good in our intentions. They make it out as if everything people do is bad, whereas actually it's these people kicking the windows in that are bad as far as I'm concerned. So they lost their humanitarian perspective. But then what happened is, because fundraising became so important, because we had a big employee base, by this time we had 1,000 people on the payroll, and it became more of a business than a voluntary organization of people trying to do good. And my fellow directors, I was one of 6 international directors for the last 6 years I was there, because we created Greenpeace International in 1979. And I had to leave because my fellow directors decided we should have a campaign to ban chlorine worldwide. And I tried to explain to them, none of whom had any formal science education, that chlorine was actually one of the most important elements for public health, because putting it in drinking water was the biggest advance in the history of public health, and in pools and spas to prevent waterborne diseases. We don't hear about cholera anymore in this world, and it was once a great purge coming through the water supply, and it no longer does because we use chlorine to disinfect the water. And also, 80% of our medicines are made with chlorine chemistry, and 25% of our medicines actually have chlorine in them. And then there's table salt, sodium chloride. It is an essential nutrient for all plants and most animals, and you just can't do without it. That's why Gandhi made salt at the sea in India, because the British were taxing it, and it is an essential nutrient for life. And he didn't think it should be taxed because of that reason, that it was if you tax it among the poorest people, they can't afford to buy it and they need it to live. So it was a symbol that he was creating with salt. And but if you eat a cup of salt, say you pour a cup of salt down you die. And this brings into perspective this whole idea in toxicology that the poison is the dose.
Yes.
Many things are poisonous at a high level, but are harmless or even necessary at low levels. And that's what a lot of people don't get, that because it doesn't just come intuitively. You have to understand it. And toxicology is a complicated thing where you have to know a lot about science. Whereas to stop nuclear testing, you don't have to be a nuclear physicist. To stop the slaughter of whales, you don't have to be a marine biologist to get it. But to get chemistry and pollution, I could go into the plastics issue as one classic example of people not getting it and really getting it wrong. Maybe I can, there, yeah, I think that's good. Did I do that right? This time?
Yes.
Yeah, and we can come back to some more slides later if you wish, but I'll let you take it from there. That's how I got to be a sensible environmentalist, by leaving Greenpeace, which had basically become racket peddling junk science, which is what they are today. And the junk science they're peddling is mostly this whole so-called climate catastrophe, which is a lie. There is no climate catastrophe.
That's exactly what I want to touch on, because I myself studied environmental science, and I know that to assume CO2 as a major influencing factor in temperature rises is not scientific, as then we're negating all the other factors such as solar mass ejection activity, geological records, volcanic eruptions, atmospheric gas changes, radiation, etc. And you're someone who's got a good knowledge on this. You are a climate scientist, I would say. So I'd love you to go into it and give everyone your perspective on what's really going on right now.
Well, right off the bat, the reason my new book, which is this one, Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom, makes the case that virtually every scare story today is based on things that are either invisible, like CO2, radiation, whatever is supposed to be bad in GMOs, obviously is invisible because no one has shown us what it is, and or remote, so remote that hardly anybody can see it for themselves. It's all about whether you can see it for yourself, which is called observation in science. You can't do an experiment without being able to observe what you're doing. And so observation is the basis of personal knowledge, because when you see something with your own eyes, you have verification of it through observation. So science goes observation, verification by seeing it over and over again, the same thing happening. Now you're thinking maybe there's a cause-effect relationship here. Then replication is when you tell other people, look, this seems to happen every time I do this. Why don't you try it and see if it works the same way for you? And then you have what's called replication by other people. And pretty soon you have a theory, because a cause-effect relationship is a special thing. And there's many correlations which are not cause-effect relationships. This is the confusion. I use shark attacks and ice cream consumption as a classic example. Shark attacks and ice cream consumption are perfectly correlated. When one goes up, the other goes up. When one goes down, the other goes down. That's because they both are influenced by a third factor, which is temperature. When it's cold, people don't eat ice cream and they don't go swimming. When it's warm, they go to the beach, have an ice cream, go swimming, and maybe get attacked by a shark. So that's why they're so perfectly correlated. Go to the website called Spurious Correlations, and you will see some of the funniest things. It's really a very entertaining website, because ice cream consumption and shark attacks, right? They don't seem to have anything to do with each other, but they're perfectly correlated. But they don't have anything to do with each other, except for they're both caused by the same third thing. So cause-effect versus correlation is a key thing to understand about the way the world works. And so I bring that up because we have no way of seeing what carbon dioxide is doing. We cannot observe what CO2 is doing. No one can look at it because it's invisible. And the same thing with coral reefs in the tropical ocean underwater. There was this big story about the Great Barrier Reef being 93% dead in 2016. This story came out and was everywhere in the media around the world. The Great Barrier Reef, 93% of the Great Barrier Reef is practically dead, 93% is dying, 93% is bleached. The coral reef is in its final terminal stage, as if there are other terminal stages before the final one. But notice that all that language does not mean dead. Practically dead doesn't mean dead, almost dead, nearly dead, terminal, right? Those are not dead. They are before dead. And so it actually didn't get dead, because this year they have admitted that there's the highest coral cover on the Great Barrier Reef since they started measuring it 36 years ago. And that's in the media, but nowhere near as much as it was when they said it was dying. So still most people think the Great Barrier Reef is dying when it is not. It is actually in a perfectly healthy state. The same thing goes for polar bears. How many people can go to the Arctic and count the polar bears? And so they tell you they are going to go extinct because the ice is going to melt. Well, first, the ice has not melted. And there are excellent satellite photos showing that even at the end of last winter, there wasn't a square inch of the Arctic that wasn't covered in ice. As a matter of fact, it's larger than that. It goes to the whole of Hudson Bay, which is not in the Arctic, is covered in ice in the winter still. The whole of the Bering Sea practically, all the way down to Norway and the north shore of Russia, which is well outside the Arctic Circle. So the entire Arctic is still covered with ice in the winter. In the summer, when there's 24 hours a day, 6 months of sunshine in the Arctic, some of it melts and leaves a big piece in the center of where the North Pole is. It doesn't melt completely, and it isn't going to melt completely. And actually this year, it is larger than it was in 2012. So nearly 10 years later, it has grown back again to some extent. So the fact is the polar bear population has grown from about 8,000 to about 30,000 since the treaty was signed among all polar nations in 1973 to end the unrestricted hunting of polar bears, which has been enforced very well ever since then. Nobody knows about that treaty. Coca-Cola doesn't tell them about that treaty when they have their ads with polar bears in to make everybody's heartstrings want to drink Coca-Cola for what that has to do with polar bears. I never understood. But they use the polar bear like it is unfair for them to use the polar bear as a symbol of the earth dying or whatever it is they're trying to portray. But they do play into that whole thing about the polar bear without telling us that there was a treaty in 73 that has been enforced and has resulted in there being at least 30,000 and perhaps as many as 50,000 polar bears today. The Inuit people who live up there all year, as opposed to people who go there for 2 weeks in the summer to study the polar bears, they live there all year, and they say there's too many polar bears. They have a government. They passed a polar bear management plan 2 years ago, which now gives them the right to defend themselves from polar bears, which had more or less been taken away by making them such a off limits. You weren't even allowed to really defend yourself from a polar bear. And they are a huge animal that can kill many people at once if they decide to. And they have actually killed a few of the Inuit people and ransacked their houses, and they want to be able to defend themselves from that. And sometimes there isn't any other way than to dispatch the animal because it gets used to garbage and all of that. And in fact, in those communities, unlike in northern Russia, where they do have garbage dumps outside the towns in the Arctic, that doesn't happen in the Canadian Arctic because we have better rules. And it's probably the same in Alaska, that there are better rules for that sort of thing. So you don't attract the bears to the village, in other words, with your garbage.
Right.
So but the whole thing about polar bears going extinct is garbage. They are actually thriving because we have protected them. And yet the media and the activists and the politicians pay the scientists to tell them that the polar bears are going extinct. That's how that works.
That's right. It's the same with all the global warming funding to universities. That's why it seems there's a lot of climate scientists or very few environmental scientists and ecologists that are willing to speak up about the flaws in the data that are presented in the mainstream media. For a start, one of the things that is a problem that most people don't know about is they use climate models, which are very erroneous as well. And I was going to ask you, can you talk a little bit to listeners about, the issues there and why we need to understand that we have to look at all these other empirical data to get a good perspective on climate, because you've studied it. You have, and people.
Yes, I have. Well, first off, I've studied it to the extent that I know that the historical record going back 500 million years, which we have good knowledge of because of ocean sediment cores, we can drill down into the sediments on the bottom of the ocean all over the world and get statistics on various parameters such as temperature and CO2. It's amazing that we figured out how to do this, but we can. And you can look back in history at the CO2 level and the temperature level, and they are out of sync as often or more than as often than they are in sync. There is no evidence of a direct cause-effect relationship between CO2 and temperature. That's not to say that CO2 isn't a greenhouse gas. It is, but it's a very minor one compared to all the other larger factors like the sun and like water vapor and water in general. See, water it has an effect on climate almost more than any other individual thing on the surface of our Earth, just leaving the sun out for a minute. Water is in 3 phases on the Earth's surface: a gas as humidity, an aerosol as clouds and fog, and the oceans. So it's a liquid in all kinds of different ways: high cloud, low cloud, the oceans, and then there's the ice, which is solid water. So water's in 3 different phases, all of which have different properties. And the ice reflects sunlight away from the Earth. The top of the clouds reflects sunlight, but the bottom of the clouds acts as a blanket to keep heat in. And the humidity is the greenhouse gas. Water is at least 90 to 95% of the greenhouse gas effect. And if it wasn't for the greenhouse gas effect, they act as though greenhouse gas is deadly. As a matter of fact, life wouldn't exist on Earth if it wasn't for the greenhouse gases, which make it warm enough here for life. The Earth would be below zero almost everywhere without the greenhouse gas called water vapor. This is easy to understand if you think of a day in a moist environment where there's cloud cover and lots of humidity in the air. The temperature doesn't fluctuate that much. But when you go to a desert where there's very little humidity in the air, it cools off really quickly at night and warms up really quickly in the day. That's because the water vapor isn't moderating the temperature through the greenhouse gas effect. But you can't see it. I mean, but this can be measured at least. Whereas the effect of CO2 on temperature, it can't be measured in this complex system that we have. There's too much going on because it's such a minor greenhouse gas that many other factors will overrule it. Whereas they actually said in part of NASA, the part that's in New York, NASA GIS, which is not the spaceship NASA, those people actually are scientists. The people at Columbia University in NASA GIS is a whole different budget and everything. And they say that CO2 is the control knob of global temperature. Now I will talk a little bit about the use of words. It is not a control knob. That's not a scientific term for a greenhouse gas. A control knob is an actual knob that controls something, like a machine, right? Or opens a window. It's not a control knob. And carbon dioxide is not carbon. So anybody who refers to carbon dioxide as carbon, just ignore them, because that is political. Carbon is carbon, and carbon dioxide is carbon dioxide. We don't call water hydrogen for short, H2O, right? Why don't we call it hydrogen? Why do they call it carbon? They call it carbon because they want you to think of soot and dirt and pollution. That's what they're giving it. They want you to think it's black. When in fact it's invisible. So I'm a climate denier, apparently. When was the last time you heard me say there wasn't a climate? I'm a climate change denier, right? So when they use these terms, which have absolutely nothing to do with science, ignore them, dispute them, argue with them, because they're lying about things. They use words like the word green, for example. I think I mentioned it earlier. That word green means nothing. I have a little ditty that goes renewable, clean, sustainable, and green. So start with renewable. That actually has a meaning. It means, like with a tree, it's renewable. You plant a seed, it renews itself. That's renewable. Solar energy is renewable. But the technology that makes solar energy into electricity is not renewable. It's made of metal and glass, and same with the wind machines. They're not renewable. So to say that that is renewable energy is a little bit misleading. But renewable, we know what it means, and mostly it means things that grow by themselves. Then there's clean. that too is definable. It means not pollution. Clean means not dirty, but in ecology, clean more or less means you're not putting toxics in a place where it harms life. So that's a pretty easy definition. Sustainable. Now, it's fun because people think sustainable and renewable are interchangeable, but they're not. Sustainable means will last a really long time at the present rate of consumption. Now, if you overfish, that's not sustainable, even though it's a renewable resource. And there's enough iron ore in the earth, which is not renewable, to last for 1 million years. So it's sustainable. So sustainable and renewable are actually quite different from each other. Then we come to green, which is absolutely not got any technical or scientific definition to it. It's a marketing term, the same way that organic food is a marketing term in a grocery store. It is not the scientific definition of organic, and there is no scientific definition of green. It is just a marketing term that they say, oh, well, we're green and you're not.
Okay,
And
so
that is just an assertion that has no basis in reality.
I agree. Let's just go back to why. Why are they not letting people know the truth? Why are they playing on people's ignorance with climate science? What do you believe is the motivation or political agenda behind it?
Well, as usual, political power and wealth. That's the way it's worked ever since the beginning of human civilization, I suppose. And many people fall for it. I don't know why, but humans are kind of like a herding animal that has leaders like a wolf pack, or many species are like that. Ours is particularly like that. So people want to belong to the herd. They want to belong to something that has meaning, but also gives you authority, gives you political power in the tribe. And we are a very hierarchical species. And there's always people like witch doctors who are pretending they know something that means they should have authority and power. And this is, this is where the interface between religion and science comes in.
Scientism.
Like, I'm very much supportive of freedom of religion, but not if it's used for evil purposes. And it can be used for, just the way politics can be used for evil purposes. Science can also be used for evil purposes. So it's evil I'm against. I'm looking for people who are actually producing truth, honesty, good, and helping others. And that's the difference here. And if you look at this doomsday scenario that they have come up with, the climate catastrophe, it is absolutely has no foundation. It's as if hurricanes just started last week or last year or 10 years ago or something. No, they've been going on since the beginning of the earth. And extreme weather events, it's really interesting how this scare story has evolved. It started with global warming. Then came a 20-year period around 2000 when no warming had happened. Statistically, no warming. So then they went to climate change. Now it could be anything to do with the climate. Could be heating, cooling, etc. But if you said, well, yeah, but it was pretty cold last winter, they'd say, oh no, that's not climate, that's weather. Weather is different from climate. Now, what do they talk about? All they talk about is weather and extreme weather events, and say that's the fingerprints of climate change on that hurricane. There's another place where they're using a word that is stupid to say there's fingerprints on a hurricane. They don't have a hurricane dusting powder.
No,
so it's just not science to say that, but they say it because they're just trying to appeal to your fear.
That's right. And what people don't seem to realize, the background to this is that Well, there's financial institutions like Goldman Sachs and politicians who have stakeholds in climate credits and trading carbon on the stock market. This is a billion-dollar industry. And
Yes.
also they use it as an excuse to repress countries that are developing like Africa, India, Latin America. So there's a very big political leverage that the West gained from peddling it. And I just wanted to add to that. So,
Well, I would say that the fake climate change movement actually targets the poorest people in the world more than anything else. So they pretend that they care. You know, they say, oh no, these people will be better off with solar energy than they would be with natural gas or nuclear power or hydroelectric and all the actual things that work. And they romanticize wind and solar when in fact it's a parasite on the economy. And they don't even care about the economy really very much because they're all filthy rich. The people in the World Economic Forum and with Greenpeace shielding themselves with this kind of power, it's all gone completely corrupt. And I don't know how we ever get out of this. It's a downward spiral right now that doesn't seem to have a bottom. But maybe we'll be surprised by how people end up reacting. I'm not certain. After the whole COVID thing, which I'm not an expert on, but I'm certainly an expert on freedom. And you don't have to tell me that that was the right way to go. It certainly wasn't the right way to go. We've crippled our economy for some reason now. The whole idea is that we can spend our way with programs that absolutely don't even add any wealth to our system. The idea of wealth has apparently been given up, and now it's all virtue.
It's all for the good of everybody, and that's the segue into communist living. Absolutely.
Precisely. Yeah, that it's a slippery slope, that is, because it's all about preaching that this is going to be great for everybody, and when in fact it ends up in, I forget how many people have left Venezuela, but it's like 20 million or something.
Yeah, I used to live in Ecuador, so we had a lot of Venezuelans come down there, and it's shocking, really.
It is, and it's the ruination of society and of civility to allow that kind of system to come in. And but I don't know what to say about Putin and the war. And
let's not go there.
Isn't that an awful place to go?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about or touch on with the whole. I remember when I think it was during the Paris COP climate talks.
I was there.
I was posting. Oh wow! I was posting some articles about it on social media, Facebook.
Yes.
And I got banned for 2 weeks for posting my articles. I couldn't post anything because, you know, I was giving a clearer picture, a more scientific and objective picture about, you know, climate and what they should be focusing on. So I'd love to hear, if you were there, you know, what you thought about that event.
Well, we had our own events there. It was really quite interesting, but you know, that ended up being the largest assemblage of private jets that had ever come together in the world at one time at the airport. That's why they had it where they had it, because it was close to the private jet port. I made a public wager during the COP Paris meeting. I said, I bet $100,000 US, and I put this out on, broadcast it on internet and news services so that it went all over the world. I made this bet. I put it in plain English. I said, I bet that in 2025, CO2 emissions will be higher than they are now in 2015. And none of the activists who are going on about how we were going to lower it by 2025 would take that bet. Nobody took the bet. That means they don't believe their own BS.
Wow.
Right? Doesn't that mean that?
Yeah.
If they actually believed it, even though they were wrong, but if they actually believed it, they would take that bet.
Right.
One person from Holland almost took it, And I bet someone told him, don't be an idiot. You're not going to win, right? And it's true. The CO2 emissions in 2025 will be considerably higher than they were in 2015. And it isn't going to affect the climate. You know, here's something everybody should know. The fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, those are the three main ones, were all made from plants and animals. The coal was made by forests on the land, being buried and turning from carbohydrates into hydrocarbons through heat and pressure and chemical reaction over millions of years. The oil and gas was made in the sea by marine creatures sinking to the bottom into the sediments year after year after year, and eventually the heat created by the pressure of the rocks on top turned it into gas and oil. So all of that fossil fuel, every bit of it, was made by solar energy, by plants and plants and animals that ate plants. It was all made by solar energy. All the carbon dioxide that was removed from the atmosphere to make those fossil fuels is simply being returned to where it came from when we burn fossil fuels. It is not something new to the atmosphere. The atmosphere had much higher CO2 in the past. And over the millennia, the CO2 level in the atmosphere has declined radically from 5,000 parts per million when modern life emerged in the Cambrian period 500 million years ago. It was 5,000 parts per million. In fits and starts, it sank to 180 during the most recent glacial advance 20,000 years ago, which is one of about 40 glacial advances that have occurred in the Pleistocene Ice Age, which is what we're in now. Is this news that this is an ice age? It's one of the coldest periods in the history of the Earth now. That's why there's huge caps of ice on the poles. We happen to be in an interglacial period, but it is not the end of the ice age. This is the Pleistocene Ice Age. And already for the past 5,000 years, on average, the temperature has been going down. We just happen to be in a slight uptick now called the modern warm period. But it was warmer in the Minoan period 3,000 years ago, warmer in the Roman period 2,000 years ago than it is now, and probably warmer in the medieval warm period when the Vikings farmed Greenland than it is now. But in about 1700 came the peak, or the nadir you would call it, because it was the lowest temperature in 5,000 years, came with the little ice age. There were crop failures and starvation in Europe. We know that for sure. What happened in the rest of the world, history hasn't remembered on our side of the world anyways. But we've now warmed up only a little over 1 degree Celsius since 1700, and everybody thinks the world is coming to an end, when in fact, it is colder even now, today, than it was for the previous 250 million years. Because we're now at the tail end of a 50 million year cooling period, which began with the Eocene thermal maximum 50 million years ago. Prior to that, there was one little dip and back up again, back to the end of the Karoo Ice Age 250 million years ago. That was the ice age before this one. Since then, 250 million years ago, the Earth has been warmer than it is now,
Okay.
all the time.
Thank you for filling us in on that.
Now, why would we be worried about the Earth getting warmer if it's colder now than it has been for 250 million years?
In the last 15 years, it's been quite cool and it hasn't warmed, according to some NASA space weather data.
Yes,
anyway.
well, it goes in fits and starts as it is, but we are in what would be expected to be a 500-year modern warm period that started 300 years ago. So maybe we have another 200 years of slight warming, and then boom, down again. And it appears as though we are on the 80,000-year descent into the next glacial maximum, if nature goes according to the last 100 last million years, there have been 10 at 100,000-year intervals, glacial maximums followed by interglacial periods for the last million years. The same pattern appears to be occurring now. It doesn't seem to be disrupted in any way. And yet they are saying that the Pleistocene ice age is over. And now we are into a new era, a new epoch, as they call it, called the Holocene, when in fact the Holocene interglacial we are in now is no different than the 40 or more that occurred previously in the Pleistocene ice age. As a matter of fact, the 3 previous ones to this were warmer than this one. And that's shown by the Greenland ice cores. So if anything we should be afraid of, it's cold. You know, 20 times as many people die from cold as heat every year on the Earth.
That's right.
20 times. Wouldn't it be better if it was even?
Yeah.
What would it take to make it even? It would take a little more warmth to make it even.
Dr. Patrick, I want to ask you, because I've got a lot more questions I wanted to ask you, but we're coming up to 4 minutes. Are you able to spend more time with me, or do you have to go?
I can spend a little more time with you.
Oh, great. That's just checking. Okay, so I wanted to say, recently there were some interesting articles about electric cars and how there's a big push towards electric cars, like with the EU and the UK. They want to reach zero emission, which is impossible. And one of the things I wanted to share with people and then ask your views on was the Natural History Museum did an interesting study. Professor Harrington and his team investigated how, if it was possible at all for the whole of Britain to switch to electric cars by 2050. And actually they're planning on they want to do that by 2025 now. And what they found when they did this investigation was that it would take 2 times the total annual world cobalt production, nearly the entire world production of neodymium, 3/4 of the world's lithium production, and at least half the world's copper production, just for the UK to convert to electric vehicles, you know, with the production of the batteries and so on. So that's from leading scientists that set out this resource challenge for meeting net zero emissions in the UK by 2050. And they found that there isn't even enough resources just for Britain to do that. But yet they're pushing for that everywhere in the world, especially the United States and so on. So I just wanted to get your views on that.
Perhaps the audience has heard the term pipe dream. And that is what this is. It is a complete fantasy. And yet people are following it, like saying, yes, let's do this. Just for starters, even if you kept the backup we now have to wind and solar, which is mostly nuclear, hydro, and gas, and some coal, when the wind and solar isn't working, you may notice that there's a thing called the night when the solar isn't working. It also doesn't work very well early in the morning or late in the afternoon when the sun is low. So you get about 6 hours average of solar if there's no clouds. There's clouds all over the place on this planet. So solar only gives you at 20% of the time, gives you a decent load of electricity. So if you took away the backups that we have today, and they're not backups, they're actually the main power. The wind and solar is only being used because they're forcing the utilities to buy it, even though it's more expensive. It is a complete perversion of economics and technology to be using this wind and solar. It's a parasite on the larger economy. There's simply no doubt about that. And people are not taking into account the amount of fossil fuels that are used in mining, all the stuff that's needed to make these technologies and the electric cars happen.
That's right.
It's
Well,
just
that's what I was going to touch on as well.
So if even if you left the system the way it is now, if you electrify all the cars, you need twice as much electricity to run the country. Where's that going to come from when they're shutting down gas and nuclear and coal? Where's it going to come from? And they even want to tear down the dams in some countries where you're making electricity with water, like as if that's against the nature. You know, it's just ridiculous. It can't happen. There's been no proper technical or economic feasibility studies on this. And indeed, if you were to eliminate the backup power, the coal, the gas, the nuclear, then you have to use batteries. And Carlita, what you're talking about doesn't even include those batteries. You're just talking about the batteries for the cars. Yeah. The batteries for the electrical system would mean, like, you can't charge the batteries when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. So the only time you can charge the batteries is when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, which means now, seeing as though the wind and solar can never produce more than a third of your necessary energy, maybe it's more like a quarter. That means that you have to have 3 to 4 times as much wind and solar capacity, because when you're running the city with wind and solar, you also have to be charging the batteries. You can't charge the batteries when there's no wind and solar. So the only time you can charge the batteries is when you're relying on the wind and solar to run the whole civilization during the time when it's available. The rest of the time, you think you're going to get 2/3 of the electricity for the whole world out of batteries? That's just, you couldn't get 1/100th of it out of batteries. That's the truth. I mean, that's a pretty small feasibility study there, but that's what I mean. They have not done the numbers on this because I believe they know it's false themselves. I don't know what their intention is. I say it's like some kind of suicide pact or death wish by these people. I mean, just to, express how extreme it is. It's almost as if they want to kill our civilization. And the thing is, as the realignment is coming, so that Russia, India, China are liable to end up in the same group, because if Russia lets, if China lets Russia take Ukraine, then Russia lets China take Taiwan, and that sort of thing is starting. Yeah. Who bombed the Nord Stream pipeline?
Oh, that was the US, actually. Biden.
Well, yeah, it's
they were going to do that.
I don't think they're admitting it.
Well, Biden did.
But they did. Yes, they said they would do it. No, I saw the 2 clips from both the president and the senior staff person in the White House. Yeah. I saw both clips. They both said, if Putin invades Ukraine, Nord Stream is gone. And the president was asked, well, how are you going to do that? And he said, don't worry, we know how to do that, or something to that effect. But it's also obvious who else would do it. Yes. No European country was going to do it. They've been dependent on that gas. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword in that Putin, Biden can't admit that he did it, or the Europeans would go nuts. But I think they know it anyways. Yep. But if you don't admit it and nobody can prove you did it, it was underwater with some kind of crawler along the bottom of the ocean with a bomb on it. Wow. I mean, that is one of the most incredible pieces of sabotage. Like the Twin Towers were pretty easy to see what was happening. Yeah. And there were all these thousands of people in them. At least there weren't any people down at the bottom of the sea in the Baltic, and it didn't harm anyone. But it sure did a big geopolitical thing.
Absolutely. And
the point is, this is all a pipe dream. The whole thing is phony, that we're going to have wind and solar running the world. It is, I always say, may they rust in place, because I really do think that would be the best thing to do with them, is just get rid of them and go back to conventional energy. Natural gas is clean. We actually know how to burn coal clean now. It's a well-known technology. It's happening all over the world. The Chinese are converting their older plants to cleaner technology. Pollution control is what it takes. And so now they're targeting the carbon dioxide. They're saying that is pollution, when in fact it is plant food which has caused 30% increase in the growth of forests and crops
right.
around the world. And NASA agrees with that.
Yeah.
And so do many of the large science organizations around the world. And they sort of put it aside because they still want their money for the climate change research.
I published an article about that some time ago, because it was in some scientific journals, and I published it because it never came out and it wasn't notified anywhere in mainstream news. And yeah, it's true.
Yes.
It is
true.
Plant
We
vegetation
are
has
greening the
increased
earth.
over 3%. So people don't know this stuff because they're not scientists, and then the journalists have no scientific background. The politicians certainly don't. So who do they consult when they make these decisions? They consult the banking industries and so on. And that takes me to the climate credit schemes that are being rolled out in Europe, where individuals are going to be allocated personal carbon allowances. And there's these electronic tradable energy quotas that are going to be proposed they've been proposed for the United Kingdom. And all of this. And then actually yesterday there was quite an interesting article that was published by Jordan Shattle in the dossier in Substack, and he announced that the Federal Reserve announced a major pilot exercise for ESG social credit score system, climate finance, almost identical to the Chinese communist social credit scoring system, which punishes dissidents from getting a plane or traveling or doing anything out of a small region. And there's even banks that are already building this climate credit system into their cards, so that if your carbon footprint goes beyond your quota, then you're not going to be able to spend your money on anything. And this is the kind of thing that it seems we're edging towards, and it's been
well, does it involve private jets?
Exactly.
Or do they just buy credits?
It seems the elites are immune to these regulations that they set for everybody else.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. So, what are your thoughts on these new social credit systems to do with climate quota for individuals?
It's so crazy. Carbon dioxide should actually be worshipped. We should be happy we have it. It makes life possible. There's no question of that. And it's been so much higher in the past than it is now, while life flourished through the whole of evolution. When the Earth was warmer, which it was, as I mentioned, for the 250 million years before this, there was flourishing life on the poles. Antarctica and the Arctic had forests on them. How many species are in the Arctic? Not many. How many species are in the Antarctic? Even fewer, because it's even colder. The poor penguins, that's amazing that something has evolved that can survive there. But on the land in Antarctic, there's not a lot of species. There are no plants, except on that peninsula. I think there's some areas there which are ice-free, but that comes way out into a much higher latitude than most of Antarctica. Most of Antarctica has been a sheet of ice for 30 million years, because the southern hemisphere is naturally colder than the northern hemisphere due to it being mostly water, whereas the northern hemisphere is mostly land, and land heats up easier than water does. So that's why the Antarctic is colder. We don't get the cold temperatures on the Arctic that they get down in the Antarctic. And this last winter, the Antarctic had the coldest temperatures they've measured in 60 years. At 60 years, I mean, that's nothing. But still, it's not warming down there. It got colder this last year. And so there is no trend that you can point to that is extreme. Slight warming has occurred over the last 300 years, very slight. And they're saying that a 1 degree more Celsius average temperature of the Earth will cause total destruction of the environment and human civilization. That's less than the difference between Miami and Washington, D.C., or between Miami and New York. The difference in temperature just within the United States, north and south, is a lot more than 1 degree average per year on an annual basis. And that doesn't cause thousands of people to be dying. And I love to say the only actual climate refugees there are the people that fly south every winter for a nice warm holiday from the cold places. Those are the climate refugees. Nobody is leaving warm places to go to cold places because it's cold. They're going there perhaps to get work. They're going there because they are actual refugees from a government that's destroying their country, like Venezuela. Where are they going to go? Some of them have probably come here to Canada. I don't think it's many, though. I think most of them are trying to go to other warm places.
This is another really important question I want to try and get in before we go to our end. The subject of geoengineering. Now, a lot of people, especially scientists and environmental scientists, will not talk about this. In recent years, there's been a number of news articles in the mainstream news, like The Guardian, Telegraph, about geoengineering operations where they claim to be dimming the sky and using it for climate mitigation. There's a lot of citizen scientists and actual scientists who've spoken out about the use of the chemicals in the aerosols they're spraying, because there's chemicals such as sulfuric acid, H2SO4, and sulfur dioxide. And it takes me back to something I saw the Environmental Protection Agency published in 1979, that plants have been found to be injured by sulfuric acid aerosol and so on. And there's all these other strange ingredients that they use, they don't disclose to the public. And I'm wondering if this is connected to the decline in insects, birds and amphibians that has been published in some science papers around the world. I just wanted to get your opinion on that.
Well, there's certainly no decline in birds where I live, in an estuary on Vancouver Island. I don't believe anything about the extinction stuff. I testified before the U.S. Congress on this alongside 3 so-called scientists from the United Nations who said that 1 million species are in danger of going extinct soon. There are only 1.7 million species identified, yet they said the best estimate is 8 million species with no names, no pictures, no description.
These are in scientific journals.
Now, the scientific journals are where the climate garbage is too, Carlita. Remember that.
I understand that.
There's no basis in this at all, except for Bill Gates and a few other people saying maybe we should do it. Well, Bill Gates is saying maybe we should put something in the atmosphere that blocks the sun.
Yes.
But nobody's doing that.
Well,
and the contrails from jets are made of water. They're not made of chemicals. They're not. Nobody is putting chemicals into the fuel.
Geoengineering is a fact.
Is not happening.
The governments have already published papers on
this. No, it is not happening. They've published papers proposing it, but it is not happening.
Well,
nobody is doing it, or you would know.
It is going on.
Show me the evidence.
Well, it's been announced in the newspapers.
No, it hasn't.
Oh no. There's also.
Certainly you don't believe in the news.
Well,
when they tell you that the Earth is going to die any minute from the climate.
There's hundreds of military patents that include geoengineering operations. So
that doesn't mean they're doing it.
Well,
this is one of those.
We'll have to agree to disagree
there. This is not real. This is one of those things that is like a boogeyman that has come in, this geoengineering and contrails. There's actually people who post photographs with 17 contrails going like this, and it's total Photoshop stuff. They do the same thing with plastic in the sea, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which doesn't exist. Right? Do you believe in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch?
There's a lot of scientists that have actually published samples that they've collected from areas where there's a great deal of spraying, and
Spraying of what?
aluminium, barium,
We're spraying it where?
and heavy metals,
Where are they
nanoparticles,
spraying
as
it?
I said, sulfur dioxide,
Where are they
all
spraying it?
over the world. It's happening
Any
everywhere.
particular place?
Everywhere, everywhere. They're dimming the sun. It's been announced in the Guardian
Oh,
and the
you mean
Telegraph.
up in the air? They're doing it in the atmosphere.
They've been doing it for years, and the Guardian and Telegraph and many other major newspapers.
It's amazing how
have
people come to
announced
believe
it.
these things.
Well, it's not just in the news, it's, you know, in science data as well. And
No, it's not in the sky either.
Well, I have to disagree with you there.
You think that the sky is being dimmed right now?
I don't believe that this is about climate mitigation. I believe it's about something else, and I don't really know what. I don't have any answers.
Well, how do you know it's happening?
Because I've seen it, and I've seen the difference between chemtrails and contrails. I can see the difference.
Really?
It doesn't just
show
stop.
it to me.
It doesn't
show it
just
to me.
stop. You don't just
Please
turn
show
it
it
off
to
and
me,
turn it
Carlita.
on. I will.
I want you
send
you don't have to use
the
this part of the interview if you don't want, by the way.
I will send you the data. I've written articles.
No, not the data. I want to see the difference. I want to see the difference between a chemtrail and a contrail in a photograph.
Yes, well, that's easy to show, because a chemtrail will show rainbow colors because the nanoparticles are picking up strange sunlight anomalies, creating rainbows where there shouldn't be rainbows in the sky. That's one point. The next
You mean
point,
rainbows in the contrails of planes?
Yes.
Well, that would be normal. That's what water droplets do. They make rainbows.
Contrails don't stay in the sky and expand.
Yes, they do.
Turn into strange clouds and with emitting smells that are chloric and
you've been up there
chlorine,
smelling these chemtrails? Good God.
Let's just agree to disagree here, but I just
yes, but you have no evidence.
There is plenty of evidence.
No, you must have it somewhere.
Like, have you heard of Dane Whittington? He's
an please
expert.
Read my book. There's absolutely nothing about chemtrails in it. It is about real things that are really happening.
That's
like the fact that the Pacific garbage patch is a hoax, and this proves it. But the chemtrails,
why do you think the Pacific garbage patch is a hoax?
Oh, let me show you why.
Okay.
Let's see if I can find it quickly here. Because this is what the Pacific Ocean looks like from a satellite. You can see the Hawaiian Islands right there in the center. They are not twice the size of Texas. There is no Pacific garbage patch. It's a lie. They make pictures, they make phony pictures of it. I've got a bunch of those in my book, actually.
Okay.
Let me show you. Here's one. Here, see how they're pointing at that blob in the ocean?
Right.
They just painted that there. And then they call it Plastic Nation, which will destroy the oceans in 10 years. And then this one here, it says down there that this is part of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. That is, in fact, a debris from the tsunami in Japan that killed 20,000 people and swept their villages into the sea. Because you can see the mountains in the background there, and there's no mountains in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Here's another one. This is another fake image of the, here. See, that's just a drawing, right? Okay, it's not really it's not really the Pacific garbage patch.
Why do you think they're lying about plastic in the ocean when there's lots of microplastic breaking down, and there's birds and fish who are consuming large amounts of plastic garbage?
Yes, the birds consume plastic as a digestive aid. Here's the kind of fakery you see. They're staging this chick, albatross chick, as if its parents fed it this much plastic into its body. The body of a chick can't hold that much plastic.
I have exactly. I have lived on the coast, and I have seen this for myself.
What have you seen for yourself?
birds dying from eating plastic.
Come on. Here's why plastic has a beneficial use in the sea. It's just like driftwood. See all those barnacles growing on this little plastic float?
Okay.
What's wrong with that?
So you don't think that the ocean
See the mother albatross giving pieces of hard plastic to its chick as a digestive aid in its gizzard.
Right.
That's why they do it. They've been doing it for 50 years, and it's
they
been
think it's stones, and birds should
no, they
be
don't.
eating
They don't think it's stones.
to grind their food, not plastic.
Yes, it's to grind their food. What's wrong with plastic? Have you ever bought food that's wrapped in plastic? I hope not.
Well, occasionally I have, because there isn't any other option. That I'm talking
But
about.
why do they put the food in? Why do they put the food in plastic? Because it prevents contamination, because it's non-toxic and inert, because it isn't poisonous. That's why.
I would say if you're an animal and you're eating lots of plastic.
No, there's no animals that are eating lots of plastic.
It could probably be a problem, especially for cetaceans, birds, and marine life. But
no, there's no evidence of that.
So
none.
Why don't you think there's evidence of that?
Because there isn't any. Evidence is something you can see.
Exactly, it's what you can see, and I've
seen whales eating plastic.
Well, I don't know about whales, but I have seen whales swept up, and some people have done analysis in their stomachs and found a lot of plastic in their stomachs.
No, there's no photograph of that. There's absolutely no evidence. They just show a whale that's beached. That's called beaching. It's not called swept up.
Well, actually, there's a lot of reasons why they can be beached. It could be
no, there's not. There's one reason why they can be beached, because
testing.
they swim out of the sea onto the land.
It also could be ultrasonic nuclear submarine testing. It could be a number of
we
things.
have to say goodbye, Carlita. Time is up.
I don't know what your agenda is, Patrick, but I have enjoyed speaking to you about various things here.
My agenda is to seek the truth and not to believe in a whole bunch of malarkey.
I'm good, but obviously there are certain things that you don't believe that I believe, and we're both.
It's not a question of belief; it's a question of actually observing. Your beliefs, I don't know where you get them from.
My beliefs are based on observation as well.
What have you observed? No, you've never observed a whale eating plastic.
I'm happy to send you data on what I've observed. But anyway, let's just plug your book. And if people want to find out more about you, please tell us where they can find your book and your website.
My book can be found on Amazon anywhere in the world, Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. Also, Confessions of a Greenpeace Dropout, which you will see associated with this book on Amazon, which is the whole history of Greenpeace plus a compendium of all the environmental issues which have substance today, and including all the ones we've talked about now plus others. And basically, I'd just like to say that we shouldn't just believe things if we haven't seen them for ourselves right up close and have evidence of what it is that we have seen, because seeing is believing is an old term, but it means observation, actual observation and knowledge. I don't understand why so many myths are created in this world, but one of them is that we are causing a catastrophe with the global climate, and it's hugely overarching that everything is bad about this, when in fact we are greening the earth with CO2 increasing to a level that plants are happy with. That's why greenhouse growers purposefully inject CO2 into their greenhouses to get higher growth. But the whole thing about plastic is just completely crazy. It's an inert subject, a substance, I mean. It is not toxic. Otherwise, we wouldn't wrap our food in it. Otherwise, we wouldn't use it for water pipes. We use plastic for water pipes because it's inert. And when it goes in the ocean, it doesn't suddenly become toxic. That's why
One point on it is, it doesn't biodegrade. It takes thousands of years to do that. So it is a
Well, then
problem
how
in
does the
that respect.
microplastic happen? This is one of the great
It's
contradictions.
broken
If
down
it doesn't
into
biodegrade,
microplastic, yes.
oh, I thought you said it didn't degrade for thousands of years.
Well, you've got, it's going to break down to a point, and that's why you have microplastics.
Pardon me?
Don't you think that's an issue?
No, because it doesn't do that.
Well,
it does break down in sunlight. It breaks down in sunlight. But the reason microplastic is being bandied about is because, again, it's invisible. So you can just say, oh, the sea is full of microplastic. No one can see it.
Well, it's easy.
Because it isn't there.
You take a sample from the ocean and you can find microplastic under a microscope.
You haven't found any microplastic under a microscope. I know you haven't.
Well,
you're believing someone else.
I have seen it for myself, but
no,
look,
you haven't.
It's my job as an interviewer just to challenge you. So please don't take what I'm challenging you personally.
It is a personal thing.
I want to give a objective perspective for everyone.
Let's go back.
I'm not just going to interview and it be like an echo chamber where I agree with everything. I'm
not asking you to. I'm disagreeing with you, not asking you to agree with me. Okay. I'm saying that on the one hand, the anti-plastic people say that plastic will never break down in 2,000 years, which I don't know why that is a problem. So what, right? Why should it be good if it breaks down?
Well,
it's meant to last forever in the soil as a pipe.
I have been on.
And just a sec, you didn't let me say the other part.
Go on.
Which is that on the other hand, they go on about microplastics as if the plastic has broken down in 2 days into things that are so small you can't even see it. Mm-hmm. So this is a total contradiction to say, first, it takes thousands of years to break down, and second, it immediately breaks down into microplastic when it's in the ocean. And then you can't see it either. And microplastic would either float or sink. So there would, the idea that this is dispersed through the water column as if the density of plastic is not important. Things either sink or float generally in the ocean, right? They don't just disperse themselves everywhere, except for plankton, which is capable of actually dispersing itself. Mm-hmm. But plastic is not capable of, reproducing. It's not life.
It's just a byproduct of petroleum. I was Rainer Marsh's...
and yes, the war on plastic is a proxy for the war on fossil fuels, because they're almost all made from fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. And then you see all these people against fossil fuels are in plastic kayaks with plastic oars and plastic coats and plastic life jackets and plastic everything, right? What? Well, why aren't you using wooden boats with some other materials? You're totally dressed in plastic.
Personally, I think it would be a good idea to recycle the plastic rather. I've been on Rainer Marsh's with a PhD.
That's a very good idea.
Listen, please, let me talk.
Much of it is.
Okay, I've been.
But Carlita, I have to go now.
Okay.
I have to have an appointment to get my Russian mantle clock fixed.
Okay, all right. You take care, and I appreciate your time and energy, and I'm really glad to speak with you today, even if we don't agree on everything. But I wouldn't be doing my job as a journalist otherwise. So I'm happy that you came. Thank you.
If we agreed on everything, there'd be no need for two of us. That's my expression to that point.
That's true. And I really encourage people to go to your website. Could you just tout that again before you disappear?
Yes, it's ecosense.me.
Ecosense.me. Okay, fantastic. Yes. Thank you so much, Patrick, Dr. Patrick.
Thanks for the banter, Carlita. I loved it.
Well done. And me too. You have a fantastic day, and please do keep in touch and come back if there's any issues you would like to talk about in the future.
Thank you. I'd love to. I hope you don't mind that I'm slightly combative.
No, not at all. It's good. It makes good viewing, and we should always be objective and question everything.
Absolutely. I agree with you there 100%. See you again, Carlita.
You take care.
Enjoyed it.
Bye.
Thanks.
Sailing beyond knowledge. Like my great friend Carlita, who's actually got a podcast called that, Sailing Beyond Knowledge. And, in a sense, that's what I've been doing. I've been getting out of the chokehold of information.
Bye-bye.